The Cloven Viscount, Chapter 1. There was a war against the Turks. My uncle, the Viscount Medardo of Turalba, was riding towards the Christian camp across the plain of Bohemia, followed by a squire called Kurt. The storks were flying low in white flocks through the thick, still air. "Why all the storks?" Medardo asked Kurt. "Where are they flying?" My uncle was a new arrival, just enrolled to please the ducal neighbors involved in that war. After fitting himself out with a horse and a squire at the last castle in Christian hands, he was now on his way to report at imperial headquarters. "They're flying to the battlefields," said the squire glumly. "They'll be with us all the way." The Viscount Medardo had heard that in those parts a flight of storks was thought to be a good omen, and he wanted to seem pleased at the sights. But in spite of himself, he felt worried. "What can draw such birds to the battlefield, Kurt?" he asked. "They eat human flesh nowadays," replied the squire. "Since the fields have been stripped by famine and the rivers dried by drought, the vultures and the crows have now given way to storks and flamingos and cranes." My uncle was then in his first youth, the age in which confused feelings, not yet stiffed, all rush into good and bad, the age in which every new experience, even macabre and inhuman, is palpitating and warm with the love of life. "What about the crows, then? And the vultures," he said, "and the other birds of prey? Where have they gone?" He was pale, but his eyes glittered. The squire, a dark-skinned soldier with a heavy mustache, never even raised his eyes. "They ate so many plague-ridden bodies, the plague got them too." And he pointed his lance at some black bushes, which, a closer look revealed, were not made of branches, but of feathers and dried claws from birds of prey. "One can't tell which died first, bird or man, or who tore the other to bits," said Kurt. To escape the plague exterminating the population, entire families had taken to the open country, where death caught them. Over the bare plain were scattered tangled heaps of men's and women's corpses, naked, covered with plague boils, and, inexplicably at first, with feathers, as if those skinny legs and ribs had grown black feathers and wings. These were the carcasses of the vultures, mingled with the human remains. The ground was now scattered with signs of past battles. Their progress slowed, for the two horses kept jibbing and rearing. "What's the matter with our horses?" Medardo asked the squire. "Signor," he replied, "horses hate nothing more than the stink of their own guts." The patch of plain where they were crossing was covered with horses' carcasses. Now some were supine, with their hooves pointed up to the sky, and others were sort of prone, with their muzzles dug into the earth. "Why all these fallen horses round here, Kurt?" asked Medardo. "When a horse feels its belly ripped open," explained the squire, "it tries to keep its guts in. Some put bellies on the ground, and others turn their backs to prevent them from dangling. But death soon gets them all the same." "So mostly horses die in this war?" "Turkish scimitars, those long curved swords, seem to be made to cleave their bellies at a single stroke. Further on, we'll see men's bodies. First it's horses, then riders. But there's the camp. On the edge of the horizon rose the pinnacles of the highest tents and the standards of the imperial army in smoke. As they galloped on, they saw that those fallen in the last battle had nearly all been taken away and buried. There were just a few limbs, and fingers in particular, scattered all over the stubble. Every now and again I see a finger pointed our way, said my uncle Medardo. What does that mean? May God forgive them, but the living chop off the fingers of the dead to get their rings. Who goes there? Said a sentinel in a cloak covered with mold and moss, like a tree bark exposed to the north wind. Hurrah for the holy imperial crown, cried Kurt. And down with the Sultan, replied the sentinel. Please, through. When you get to headquarters, do ask them to send along my relief, because I'm starting to grow roots. The horses were now at a gallop to escape the clouds of flies surrounding the camp and buzzing over the heaps of excrement. Many's the brave man, observed Kurt, whose dung is still on the ground when he's already in heaven. And he crossed himself. At the entrance, they rode past a series of canopies, beneath which thick-set women with long brocade gowns and bare breasts greeted them with yells and coarse laughter. The pavilion of the courtesans, said Kurt. No other army has such fine women. My uncle was riding with his head turned back to look at them. Careful, senor, added the squire. They are so foul and pox-ridden, even the Turks wouldn't want them as booty. They're not only covered with lice and bugs and ticks, but even the scorpions and lizards make nest in those women now. They passed by the field batteries. At night, the artillerymen cooked their rations of turnips and water on the bronze parts of the swivel guns and cannons, burning hot from the day's firing. Carts were arriving full of earth, which the artillerymen were passing through sieves. Gunpowder is scarce now, explained Kurt, but the soil of the battlefield is so saturated with it that a few charges can be retrieved there. Next came the cavalry stables, where, amid the flies, the veterinarians were at work patching up the hides with stitches and belts and plasters of boiling tar, while horses and doctors neighed and stamped. The long stretches of infantry encampments followed. It was dusk, and in front of every tent soldiers were sitting with bare feet in tubs of warm water, as they were used to sudden alarms night and day. They kept helmet on head, and pike, their spear, tight in fist, even at foot bath time. Inside taller tents draped like kiosks, officers would be seen powdering their armpits and waving lace fans. That's not from effeminacy, said Kurt. It's just the opposite. They want to show how at ease they are with the rigors of military life. The Viscount of Tirabla, was immediately introduced into the presence of the emperor. In his pavilion and trophies, the sovereign was studying future battle plans. Tables were covered with unrolled maps, and the emperor was busy sticking pins in the maps, taking these from a small pincushion proffered by one of the field marshals. By then, the maps were so covered with pins that it was impossible to understand a thing, and to read them, pins had to be taken out and then put back. With all this pinning and unpinning, the emperor and his marshals, to keep their hands free, had all the pins between their lips, and they could only talk in grunts. At the sight of the youth, bowing before him, the sovereign let out a questioning grunt, and then took the pens out of his mouth. "A knight has just arrived from Italy, your majesty." They introduced him. "The Viscount of Torrebla, from one of the noblest families in Genoa." "Well, let him be made a lieutenant at once." My uncle clicked spurs to attention, while the emperor gave a regal sweep of the arm, and all the maps folded in on themselves and rolled away. Though tired, Medardo went to sleep that late that night. He walked up and down near his tent, and heard calls of sentries and neighs of horses, and broken speech from soldiers in sleep. He gazed up at the stars of Bohemia, and he thought of his new rank, of the battle the next day, of his distant home, and of the rustling reeds in its brooks. He felt no nostalgia or doubt or apprehension. Things were still indisputably whole, as he was himself. Could he have foreseen the dreadful fate awaiting him? He might have even found it quite natural, with all its pain. His eyes kept straying towards the edge of the dark horizon, where he knew the enemy camp lay, and he hugged himself with crossed arms, content to be certain both of the distant and differing reality, and of his own presence amidst it. He sensed the bloodshed. He sensed the bloodshed in that cruel war, poured over the earth in innumerable streams, reaching even him, and he let it lap over him without feeling outrage or pity. So that's the end of chapter 1. There are several things that I think you should notice, and let's go back and look at them. First, you should notice that when this story begins, we're introduced to the Viscount, but the narrator says, "my uncle." So we know that the narrator of this story is a young boy, and he's telling this story about his uncle. It's obviously the future, and he's talking about this thing that happened in the past. I do want you to notice that as he's riding off to war, the Viscount does look like Don Quixote, and Kurt looks like Sancho Panza. That's the image they have. We get a symbol right away, storks. Storks are always symbolic in literature, but they usually symbolize new life. Like, that's where we get that myth that storks are where babies come from. Sometimes when you have little kids, that's what you tell them, instead of telling them where babies really come from, which you should do. But anyway, we have this strange image because what you get over and over are the images of death and war and famine and disease. Now, you should know that this book takes place 400 years ago, and it takes place at a time when Christians were fighting Muslims, much as they do now. But this book was written right after World War II. So even though we're talking about the horrors of war 400 years ago, it still evokes images of war that's very recent in Italo Calvino's mind. They go off to war, and we get the sense that the Viscount is a very young man, and he's very naive, and he doesn't really understand what he's getting himself into. He doesn't realize that he's going to be injured, well, right in the next chapter, and he doesn't realize how hopeless and horrible and awful all of this is. But we do see it. We imagine all those horses dying because the Turks are cutting their bellies open. And we see that these prostitutes, that the line of courtesans are horrific and scary and ugly like witches. And we see all these dead bodies and dead body parts and piles of excrement. And this is the image of war that you have. But you also have the commanders and the emperor acting as if everything is perfectly normal and perfectly fine, and this is how things should be. When really what we're looking at is something horrific and grotesque. I think one of the reasons this story takes place in this war between Christians and Muslims is because there have been many wars between Christians and Muslims. It's almost cliche now, as if you're going to have a fantasy story, that these would be the two groups that would fight each other. Um, I also need you to get that the people that are going off to war in this are really naive. So, chapter 1 ends with the Viscount Medardo going off to sleep and thinking about home. But it says he felt no nostalgia or doubt or apprehension. And he also notices all the cruelty and horrors of war, but he goes to sleep, and it doesn't really affect him. He doesn't feel outrage, he doesn't feel pity. But we should, because we get that this is a really awful, awful thing.
So, I want to remind you a little bit about what happened in chapter 1 and what you need to know for chapter 2. Um, the Viscount Medardo has gone off to war. He's fighting for the Christians against the Muslims, and as far as I can tell, that's all we know about what this war is about. The war seems to be horrific. Dead bodies, plague, body parts everywhere, dead horses, even the vultures and the crows are dead. It's just horrific, the images. The Viscount gets there, and he's immediately given a title, and they make him a lieutenant at once. And so the next morning, in chapter 2, he's going to go off to war. But I want to remind you of what it says at the very end of chapter 1. There's a space between the paragraphs. That the last paragraph just sort of stands alone. And it says, though tired, Medardo went to sleep that night. He walked up and down near his tent and heard calls of sentries and neighs of horses and broken speech from soldiers in sleep. And he gazed up at the stars of Bohemia. He thought of his new rank, of the battle the next day, of his distant home, and the rustling of the reeds in the brooks. That sound of the reeds in the brooks, I think we've talked about that before. It's an interesting symbol. It reminds us that what's happening in this book is mythical and fantastical. It says Medardo felt no nostalgia or doubt or apprehension. But when you're going off to war, you should feel those things, doubt and apprehension or fear. It's almost like he doesn't have a good sense of his own mortality. It just says this: things were still indisputably whole, as he was himself. Now we know that he's going to be cut in two, but the last paragraph here is setting you up for the change. It says, could he have foreseen the dreadful fate awaiting him? He might have even found it quite natural, with all its pain. His eyes kept straying towards the edge of the dark horizon, where he knew the enemy camp lay. And he hugged himself with crossed arms, content to be certain both of the distant and differing reality and of his own presence amidst it. He sensed the bloodshed in that cruel war, poured over the earth in innumerable streams, reaching even him, and he let it lap over him without the feeling of rage or pity. There's something wrong with a man who can be aware of that suffering and not really feel something because of it. Chapter 2, which you're going to read after this video, begins with him showing up for battle. The first sentence says, battle began punctually at 10 in the morning. From high on the saddle, Lieutenant Medardo gazed over the broad array of Christians readying for the attack. Then he raised his face to the wind of Bohemia, swirling with chaff like some dusty barn. When I was your age, I didn't know what chaff was. It's the seeds on the wheat. It's what we make flour out of, which is essentially what we make bread out of. But when you're cultivating wheat, you need a tool. It's the same tool that death carries. You need a sickle. And that image of the chaff blowing around in an old barn, that is a symbol of death. So we begin with this sort of death imagery, and there are a few things that I want you to look at. I want you to notice that the Turks look differently than the Christians. They dress differently, but they are all fighting more or less the same. They are all kind of the same. The other thing that I want you to think about is I want you to notice what happens, the violent, awful thing that happens. Now, this story, it's a fantasy. It's kind of like Alice in Wonderland. Things happen in that story that could never happen in the real world. For example, in the last chapter, there's a sentry there. But when he says he's been there so long he's growing roots, he kind of means it literally. That's what I picture in my head. It describes him growing moss like a tree and growing roots. That's fantastical. You don't see that in the real world, of course. But that's the genre of this book. The thing about this genre, this fantasy genre, is it's allegorical. He's trying to teach us something. He's telling us a story about something that happened 4 years ago, but really it's to teach us about something that just happened. And more importantly, it's to teach us about ourselves. Okay. Once you finish this video, I need you to go on and read chapter 2. You can do it. Enjoy.